This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Warwick Gould, the first and very definitely ex-director of the Institute, 1999 to 2013. But it's my honour to introduce Simon Eliot in what is his last lecture as the University of London and indeed the country's first professor of the history of the book. And characteristically in that lecture, once again, he's going to recast book history. This is a post, incidentally, that he is now relinquishing, I think, for the third time, having been brought back by popular demand twice in the last couple of years. He's neither shy nor retiring by nature, but he is exceptionally shy about retiring. He doesn't want a fuss made, so I'm going to make only a very few words of retrospect and profound thanks before I get myself out of the way too. Now, according to Hugh Kenner, who was one of Ezra Pound's more devoted explainers, Pound told T.S. Eliot, "You let me throw the bricks through the front window, you go round the back and take out the swag." Much as I dislike any comparison with Ezra Pound, the remark describes with some accuracy my relation with Simon during 23 years of setting up the Institute and putting it onto a path very much dictated by the history of the book in its widest sense. It is Simon who initiated its remarkable run of successful external research grants. You have to think of Simon rather like a burglar with a black mask over his eyes, a horizontally striped jersey, and a sack on his back labelled swag. In our resourceful partnership, my job was simply this: rudely to awaken the University of London to the possibilities of a new institute with a new degree in the history of the book, and to put in place the requisite machinery through various committees. We were, as I've often remarked, trying to fulfill here the vision of several elder statesmen of the subject who probably judged our capacity by little more than the fact that we were young enough to push their vision through with some energy. I think of the late Donald Mackenzie of Oxford and the late Robin Alston of the British Library and University College London, who designed and initially directed the MA in the history of the book, which opened for business 20 years ago this year. And I think too of our strategist and friend, Ian Willison, the first of our senior research fellows, who is here tonight, and who had the patient restlessness and the networking skills, as the first of our senior research fellows, to keep pushing himself, his subject, and us forward, inspired by the example of the Great History of the Book in Britain project, which is even now moving to its climax. Simon joined these founding fathers in devising and developing our new degree. Increasingly, it bore his signature. He became, while still at the Open University, the second director of that master's degree in 1997. His swag bearing, however, really began with the devising and drafting of Between Two Worlds, Victorian novelists and publishers, our first successful pioneering external research grant, which proved to two universities, this one and the University of Reading, and to the new Humanities Research Board, that the history of the book was the right point of intellectual departure for a new Institute of English Studies, and I'm pleased that Andrew Nash, the postdoc we chose, is here tonight. Simon finally came to us as the first professor of the history of the book in December 2005, bringing with him, as it were, the funding from OUP for the writing of its history, and the first 3 volumes of that were published 18 months ago. Simon, it was, who marshalled almost 50 contributors, an astonishing feat of project management, and in bringing the postdocs to these and other projects, Simon began planting out the subject, working through the Institute's established pattern, research seminars, conferences, and new research partnerships, nationally and internationally. He took the lead in shaping the Institute's institutional image through the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading and Publishing. He managed an inter-institutional faculty and an interdisciplinary subject. He put in place the London Rare Book School. I think, too, of the Reading Experience database, a project which he devised and in which the Open University acted as lead partner with the Institute. And he capped all this off in 2013 by securing the Ministry of Information research project for the building in which the Ministry itself had been housed. Neither of us knows quite where the Institute might go after its new director arrives in December, but I think we would take some persuasion not to think that the history of the book and allied disciplines in textual transmission, paleography, editorial studies have proved a core from which English can honourably engage with multidisciplinary partners, as well as seek successfully external research funding, which of course everyone needs. And I think such funding is most usefully to be found in that particular cluster of subjects. And there is absolutely no doubt that it has sustained in the last two, to us I think rather pointless years, during which so much time has been wasted. In short, there is work to do. It's characteristic of Simon Eliot to devote his last lecture in his chair to a vision of where to go from here. And that vision is, he tells me, in three parts. First, he will explain why the history of the book needs to conceive of itself as part of a broader subject. And he will give examples of questions that the broader subject raises. They're questions which cannot easily be avoided. He will propose a hypothesis which will help articulate the new subject. Third, and finally, he will describe a current research project that practices what is indicated by this hypothesis. We won't be having a question session at the end of the lecture, but of course you are all welcome to join us outside for a drink and to continue the discussion with Simon Eliot. Simon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Warwick, for those kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, as the key words in the title of tomorrow's conference are dissemination, production, and information, let me start with a quotation from Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, first published in 1621, which addressed these very same subjects nearly 400 years ago. I hear new news every day, and those ordinary rumours of war, plagues, fires, inundations, thefts, murders, massacres, meteors, comets, spectrums, prodigies, apparitions of towns taken, cities besieged in France, Germany, Turkey, Persia, Poland, etc. Daily musters and preparations, and such like, which these tempestuous times afford. Battles fought, so many men slain, monarchies, shipwrecks, piracies and sea fights, peace, leagues, stratagems, and fresh alarms. A vast confusion of vows, wishes, actions, edicts, petitions, lawsuits, pleas, laws, proclamations, complaints, grievances are daily brought to our ears. New books every day. Pamphlets, corantos, stories, whole catalogues of volumes of all sorts. New paradoxes, opinions, schisms, heresies, controversies in philosophy, religion, etc. Now come tidings of weddings, maskings, mummeries, entertainments, jubilees, embassies, tilts and tournaments, trophies, triumphs, revels, sports, plays. Then again, as in a new shifted scene. Treasons, cheating tricks, robberies, enormous villainies of all kinds, funerals, burials, deaths of princes, new discoveries, expeditions, now comical, then tragical matters. Today we hear of new lords and officers created, tomorrow of some great men deposed. And then again of fresh honours conferred. One is at loose, another imprisoned. One purchaseth, another breaketh. He thrives, his neighbour turns bankrupt. Now plenty, then again dearth and famine. One runs, another rides, wrangles, laughs, weeps, etc. This I daily hear, and such like, both private and public news, amidst the gallantry and misery of the world. Now, as a book historian, it seems to me that the words in this conference's title, and the words of Robert Burton, together make it abundantly clear that the subject has a broader remit than would be implied by the activities undertaken by many, though by no means all, book historians in the last 4 decades or so. Book history has been a success story and has produced much good and some outstanding scholarship. At its best, in the work of, say, Don Mackenzie, Robert Darnton, and Henri Jean Martin, or some of the excellent work being done on the history of maps and of science books. It has a breadth and a degree of explanatory power which justifies us in thinking of the subject as fundamental to the study not just of the humanities, but of many activities of humankind. As we are, as a species, defined, as Burton vividly reminds us, by our unrivaled ability to communicate, for good or ill. However, for perfectly understandable historical reasons, quite a few book historians have rather bypassed these broader matters. Instead, many have concentrated, at least in the Anglophone world, on imaginative literature of one sort or another. This could be explained partly by the fact that book history emerged at a time when postmodern literary theory, in its various extraordinary guises, was predominant in departments of literature. For those who were unconvinced by this, book history offered a way out, for it was a material, evidence-based discipline in which things were, to use Karl Popper's invaluable term, falsifiable. These boatloads of literary scholars, escaping unpleasant regimes and failed states, represented a positive and valuable influx, but it did mean that the subject areas on which many alighted were, in terms of human communication, rather narrow. Literature took centre stage, at least in 18th to 20th century studies. It would have been better had this occurred a generation before, when bibliography was still taught as part of university English. Bibliography with its intense concentration on the materiality of the book and an insistence on a rigorous and systematic approach to it would have stiffened the discipline, but by the 1980s, this was a waning influence. Now, I'm not arguing that we should move away from literature, but I do suspect that the balance is not quite right. Literature needs to be put in a much broader perspective. Let me illustrate this by taking 3 quick examples, which together cover some 5,000 years of book history. In the 3rd millennium BC, most texts were not literary. Overwhelmingly, texts in cuneiform on clay tablets were concerned with commercial, legal, religious, and educational matters. While in the 3rd millennium AD, the majority of money is made by publishers working in the educational, factual, and science, technological, engineering, and medical STEM subjects. 200 years ago, publishing religious texts featured strongly as a highly profitable activity, and in some religious cultures, it is no doubt still raking in the cash. In other words, we need to recast the net much more widely if we are to do proper justice to the history of all books, or at least more types of books, over the last 5,000 years. But even this aim, noble and ambitious as it is, will not suffice. Books, despite the digital revolution, are, at least as far as the historian is concerned, material objects in a material world. They are devices of human communication which are usually required to move from one human being or group to another if they are to perform their functions. It may just be a simple message on one clay tablet being moved down a royal road in Persia from a king to one of his satraps. Or it may be Lutheran pamphlets being smuggled into East Anglia across the North Sea in the 1530s. Or the latest edition of a freebie newspaper being spread throughout the London underground system. They all have to be distributed. And we need to understand the systems of transport and transmission that allow such communications to be disseminated. If the medium does modify the message, should we be surprised that the means by which that medium is transported also constrains what can and cannot be conveyed? If we are to respond effectively to these matters, we shall need a bigger subject than the history of the book. One that can accommodate the sending and receiving of messages, expected and unexpected, between peoples and over space and time. One that sets such activities in a material context, in much the same way as archaeology does, and takes full cognizance of the shaping power of economics and technology. Such a discipline would need to address 4 interlinked processes. The first one is transport, the moving of people and goods by roads, rivers, canals, sea lanes, railways, motorized transport, aircraft, even Voyager 1 and 2 spacecraft now leaving the solar system, each with a gold disc giving information about who and where we are. All these allow messages and/or messengers to be moved about in physical space. Number 2, transmission. The various mostly electromagnetic means which allow information to be sent in non-physical forms: beacon fire, smoke signals, visual telegraph, electric telegraph, telephone, cinema, radio, TV, and the web. Third, translation. The process which enables the spread of communication beyond the original language and culture that generated it. This frequently requires not merely the conversion of one language to another, but also the process of transliteration and trans-editing, which make a message intelligible, or at least acceptable, to another culture. This, by the way, would include all that pseudepigrapha, the forgeries and counter-forgeries that make the study of any religion of the book such a puzzling and such an entertaining business. And fourthly, transaction. Barter systems, bullion money, token money, and all forms of credit system, which allow the transmission and translation of economic value. For the last few years, a number of us have been thinking of the history of the book not as an independent subject, but as a subset of a broader discipline, which, for want of a better phrase, we call the history of communication. This is a large enough subject to be intellectually self-sufficient, in a way that the history of the book cannot be. This is because there are so many unstated and unexplored processes in book history, without which, in practice, text and graphics, indeed information of any sort, could never have been delivered to its readers. In addition, history of communication will allow us to tackle the communication of other sorts of cultural information not found in texts, such as time, only standardized in the UK in the 1840s by the use of the telegraph, and money. What about the history of the promissory note in the checkbook? The history of communication would also encourage us to take seriously texts that frequently get marginalized in the history of the book, such as letters, both personal and public. For instance, letters combined with roads can take us from Babylonian monarchs communicating to their civil servants, through worried Egyptian parents in Oxyrhynchus, through bored Roman auxiliary soldiers at Vindolanda, through the dubious dealings of Tudor merchants in London, to the ways in which Keats, on a walking tour, laid out a letter on a single sheet of paper to save money, but also reserved certain parts of that sheet for certain sorts of information. History of communication would also allow us to tackle postal systems, from those run by Assyrian monarchs to the introduction of the penny post in the 19th and postal codes in the 20th. Associated with these later developments is another text almost wholly ignored by book history: the freely distributed catalogue. Think of the Army and Navy schools, Macy's, Gamages, Little's, Argos, that helped spread knowledge of a world of consumer goods, made accessible by sections and subsections that were almost linear in their order. The history of communication would also talk much more clearly and directly to the average reader's experience. For instance, the growth in working class literacy in the late 19th century UK was closely bound up with the seaside postcard, as well as with cheap school reading books. This would place subjects currently on the margins of book history, if they're there at all, much closer to the centre of attention. Jobbing printing and all the ephemera it produced accounted for over 41% of the total net value of the British printing and publishing industry in 1907. Where is it in book history? In the same survey, by the way, periodicals accounted for 28% and printed books for just 5.3%. Where is the printed advertising and packaging? You can certainly find references to such things in Heart of Darkness or Joyce's Ulysses. They're certainly there in the archives, and Michael Twyman and others at Reading have done much to draw our attention to them. But we need more. Has anyone, for instance, looked at the Stationers' Hall commercial registers for the late 19th century, in which a rich sample of such material has been accumulated? Collectively, these images and texts probably occupied almost as much of an average reader's time in the 1890s as a current novel, and certainly more than a poem or a play. But where are they now in book history? By the way, by the 1930s, the Stationers' Registry books were recording hosts of knitting patterns, texts that would have been as read as attentively and as assiduously as a chapter of the Bible. A few years ago, Ian Stevenson and I ran a set of seminars organised jointly by the Institute of English Studies and the Centre for Publishing at University College London. This brought together sociologists, sinologists, classicists, medievalists, early modernists and modernists, who found much common ground when, for instance, discussing the culture of roads, and the inclination to use letters transmitted along them merely for reassurance and confirmation, the I'm okay, you're okay phenomenon. This, of course, can be found alive and well today on Facebook, Twitter, and Snapchat. Unlike literary scholars, historians of communication should never underestimate the power and significance of the fatuous, of the predictable, and of the platitudinous. Humanities subjects are not sciences, but we might benefit occasionally from proposing models or hypotheses of how a certain form of communication worked, and then testing that model against known and newly acquired data. And we should go where the data leads us. Of course, for this to be a practical possibility, we shall need to develop some pretty large databases so that we can push the history of communication towards big data where possible and where appropriate. We already have one such, even if it is limited and difficult to use well, Google Books with its Ngram tool. But short title catalogues are usable, and Copac even more so. The emergent discipline of social physics, with its ability to mine reality by extracting millions of discrete activities on the web, will certainly provide us with an account of, for instance, some aspects of current real reading, as opposed to what people claim they read. We need, however, to go further and to be much more active. We cannot afford simply to wait for the data to come to us. For instance, we need to collect much more quantifiable evidence of print production, numbers of editions and impressions, print runs for each impression, costs and prices of books. William Sinclair and I have for a long time been stressing the need for this, or at least for a trial run, to prove that it's possible. Certainly much more systematic collection of data needs to take place if we are ever to understand the importance and size, for instance, of the cheap reprints market in the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. I'd now like to give you a few specific examples derived from various research projects that forced me to think there was a pressing need to set the study of the history of text in the broader context of communication, where, in other words, the material reality surrounding text significantly affected the form of that text, or the way in which it was received. Let me start. As much of the history of communication is driven and shaped by economic factors, with money, and the idea of transaction as being part of communication history. In the 7th century BC, the kings of Lydia, which is now in Turkey, issued weighed and guaranteed pieces of metal stamped with the royal badge, a lion's head, as a guarantee of trustworthiness. These were made of electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of silver and gold. However, the last king in this royal line introduced a new bimetallic system based on gold to silver ratio of 1 to 10. As a consequence, he was perhaps the first man in history whose wealth could be accurately calculated to the last silver coin in the standard unit that his civil servants had devised. His name was Croesus. Rich as Croesus was not a very useful phrase unless you could also tell how rich Croesus was. However, in the past, coins could have functions in addition to communicating value or wealth. Ancient coins were not like our modern ones. Anyone possessing, being offered, or receiving a gold or silver coin would look at each and every one closely, as the value of such a coin rested on its size, purity, and weight. A coin that was worn, or one that had been clipped, or one that had the wrong colour, would not be worth what it claimed to be worth. Thus, each coin had to be observed and attended to. Additionally, the images on both sides were often in high relief, unlike modern coins. This is a tetradrachma from about 470 BC with Athena and the Athenian owl. So the owl of Athena, or the emperor's profile, would be felt as well as seen. Many of these coins were message bearers, carrying images of the latest triumph in war or the latest great building project, and would be surrounded by text that reinforced the point. This extraordinary coin was issued by Brutus and celebrated the assassination of Julius Caesar. You can see the daggers and the Ides of March. That's a silver denarius of Vespasian, which was celebrating his son's conquest of Judea, and there's an imprisoned Jew on the obverse. Frequently in the Roman Empire, a new batch of coins would be minted to transmit the latest message that the authorities wished those under them to receive. That's a brass sesterces by Titus celebrating the completion of the Colosseum. What a magnificent illustration that is. So 2 millennia before printing emerged in the West, the mass manufacture and mass distribution of text and image through the minting of millions of coins was already underway. My second example brings us much nearer to home. Until the arrival of gas lighting in the early 19th century, and even more so electric lighting from the 1880s onwards, finding enough light and managing it was part of the reading experience. It would certainly have substantially modified the whole process. And just to give you some indication of the problems of reading or doing anything by candlelight, this is an illustration called The School at Night, painted between 1660 and 1665. Here is Thomas Hardy in Far from the Madding Crowd, published in 1874, describing Bathsheba Everdene watching the hero Gabriel Oak as he reads, or probably rereads, one of his very few books. I quote, "From her standing place in the road, she could see him plainly, sitting quite still, his light curly head upon his hand, and only occasionally looking up to snuff the candle which stood beside him." Reading by candlelight required the reader to stop and trim or snuff the wick every 10 minutes, lest the one source of light available should diminish or be extinguished. Reading would have been regularly and frequently interrupted by an act that had to be done very carefully indeed. If it were not, you might plunge yourself into a darkness much more profound than the light pollution of today would allow. Lighting was a key factor, not just in the consumption of texts, but also in their production. Here is a comment on the composing and printing of books in OUP's Clarendon building in the early 19th century in Oxford. I quote, "Again, the light by which the printer was expected to do his work on dark days was afforded by tallow candles stuck in tin candlesticks, which were loaded with lead at the bottom to prevent their being upset." And that is such a candlestick that was found in the OUP archives about 20 years ago with its original tallow candle in place. The compositor placed his candles in the boxes of his case. He was allowed 2 if he happened to be working, as he does now, with 3 pairs of cases. Otherwise, he had only 1. The pressman lodged his in the most convenient places he could find in or near his press. The foreman printer gave out these candles, and a boy went round in the morning and collected the drippings and the gutterings as his perquisite. How the Clarendon building escaped being burned to the ground long before it was abandoned by the printers is a marvel. I put that up to remind you that if you're going to use a candle to read, you've actually got to have the candle between you and the book. As suggested here, working by candlelight was not only difficult, it was also dangerous, and to readers as well as makers of books. On the 22nd of October 1824, the Times reported, I quote, "On the room door being opened, a cloud of smoke issued, and the unfortunate woman was discovered sitting in a chair, her clothes reduced to cinder, and her person burnt in the most horrid manner. The wretched sufferer was conveyed to Guy's Hospital, where she lingers in a hopeless state. A playbook lay near her, which it is supposed she was reading, and becoming drowsy, the candle set fire to her headdress." One principle of that story is don't read in bed, at least if you've only got a candle. Reading could be dangerous and even life-threatening, not something we now think about when we curl up with a paperback under electric light. And Hogarth makes the point in a late engraving where you have a short-sighted politician who's setting fire to his tricorn hat. Mention of the Times newspaper gives me the cue to shift to the third example of materiality at the heart of communication, as we move from light to roads and newspapers. In Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, the heroine, Catherine Morland, also has a crisis with a candle and is plunged into frightening darkness. But I want to look at another incident slightly further on. Catherine's Gothic-infected imagination has turned the cold and selfish General Tilney into the likely murderer of his wife. His son, Henry Tilney, gently corrects Catherine, and I quote, "Consult your own understanding, your own sense of the probable, your own observation of what is passing around you. Does our education prepare us for such atrocities? Do our laws connive at them? Could they be perpetrated without being known in a country like this, where social and literary intercourse is on such a footing, where every man is surrounded by a neighbourhood of voluntary spies, and where roads and newspapers lay everything open? Apart from rather chilling voluntary spies, perhaps grimly inevitable in the Napoleonic period, the coupling of roads and newspapers is profoundly significant. That's a map of the turnpike road system in 1770 in England and Wales. It was the development of this system at the end of the 18th century which allowed rapid expansion in newspaper production and delivery. It was the command of the mail coach timetables from London that enabled the firm that was to emerge as W.H. Smith's to become the predominant distributor of periodicals and later of books in the UK in the 19th century. This was a transport system that generated its own cloud of ephemera in terms of printed timetables and advertisements. The late 18th century road system presents us with a classic information network, not unlike the Roman road system, with its mancios every 25-30 kilometres along the way, functioning almost as repeater stations. In the case of the British system, its mancio was a coaching inn every 10 to 15 miles, which provided sets of fresh horses and food for travellers, although the usually short stops, often no more than 20 minutes or so, would not have provided much respite. A series of illustrations. It's the one on the top right that is quite interesting. The mail coach is arriving, and down the steps comes a waiter to take orders for food to be consumed in 15 to 20 minutes. These inns offered, as did many pubs and coffee houses, a range of reading matter, much of it in the form of periodicals, which travellers might scan briefly before reboarding the coach. Here is Byron, writing to Leigh Hunt on 9th of February 1814 about his coach journey from Newstead Abbey to London. Quote, "I've been regaled at every inn on the road by lampoons and other merry conceits on myself in the ministerial gazettes." Not just lighting there, but a pattern of travelling would often break up the reading experience into small, possibly indigestible chunks, very much like the in-mails that also might have been hastily consumed. My fourth example moves us into the mid-19th century to look at another form of transport at a mail system and a means of transmission. This is an illustration of the broad-gauge Great Western mail train near London in January 1849, and you will notice that there's a Cook and Wheatstone telegraph, set of telegraph posts running along parallel to the railway track. In the early 1860s, the delegates of Oxford University Press appointed Alexander Macmillan as their London publisher. This was at the beginning of a major transformation in the press's output, in particular the creation of a new series of textbooks under the generic heading of the Clarendon Press Series. Inevitably, this was long in gestation, partly because the delegates and their new secretary, Bartholomew Price, were innocents abroad in terms of large-scale, cheap mass production of textbooks. They needed frequent advice of the complicated sort that could not be delivered exclusively by letter, though letters were frequently exchanged, and the frequency with which they were collected and the speed with which they were delivered was itself a monument to the penny post. What additionally was required was Macmillan's frequent attendance in Oxford and Price's frequent presence in London. Both men were busy. Macmillan with many other ventures, Price with teaching, college affairs and other press business. Neither could spend a whole day on a meeting and the associated travel. Their letters are full of details about which train to catch and how long they might spend in a meeting before catching the last express home. Demands to be informed by return of post or by tomorrow night's post were common, more often associated with telegrams that followed up letters or which letters superseded. This created a speedy feedback loop for both protagonists, which allowed them quickly to adjust their advice and behaviour in the light of the other's equally rapid response. In 1865, Macmillan wrote, "I hope my letter reached you before my telegram." In 1869, Price, worried about the tough line that he'd been instructed by the delegates to take with Macmillan, wrote the next day with his apologies and was relieved to receive on the day following an emollient reply, to which he then immediately responded by suggesting a way forward and adding, "So telegraph if you approve." Such crises prompted a spate of letters and telegrams with a frequency and immediacy that was closer to email than one might have expected, as Price struggled to interpret the delegates from Macmillan, and Macmillan strove to explain the commercial imperatives of a London textbook publisher. This was a publishing relationship that simply could not have been conducted a generation earlier. This is made vividly clear by an event 20 years previously. Alexander Macmillan had been obliged to take a horse-drawn coach from London to Cambridge, travelling on the outside of the coach, to provide support for his ailing brother Daniel. So long and so cold was the journey that Alexander arrived almost as ill as his brother, and thus was of very little use to him. To put it crudely, without the penny post and the Paddington to Oxford railway line, which offered 13 out and return services a day, the cooperative venture between Macmillan and OUP, which set up the publishing arm of the press in London, simply would not have happened. My fifth and final example takes the implications of the telegraphic system from a national to an international dimension. Some years ago, I was working on the archives of A.P. Watt, the first professional literary agent in the UK. His firm expanded rapidly in the 1880s, partly in response to the creation of the Society of Authors in 1883 and the standardization of international copyright through the Berne Convention of 1886. The files from the early years were conventional enough, though at the time stored in shoeboxes, if I remember correctly. They consisted mostly of manuscript letters and drafts and final copies of author-publisher contracts. By the late 1880s, a new element had crept in. By the early 1890s, it was a common feature: copies of telegrams to and from the literary agent. This is an International Telegraph map from 1902. It's clear that by the late 1880s, Watt was using the International Telegraphic System to coordinate multiple serializations of novels in order to ensure that copyright was established and exercised. By now, I must be running the serious risk of being denounced as yet another academic collector of disparate data. So I shall now, like a zoom lens, pull out to cover all these examples and many more, which should and could be included in a model that might help us make sense of the history of communication. This is the second part of my talk and takes the form of a proposal for a hypothesis which, for want of a better phrase, I'm going to call the ecology of communication. At any given time, in most societies, there are a variety of ways in which information can be communicated in terms of the material object used, the transport systems on which many of them relied, and the modes of transmission employed. It may be that in many societies in the past, these ways were few and the information limited. In more advanced societies, this was not the case. In such societies, the means of communication and what they communicated often overlapped and sometimes competed for attention and effect. We might therefore think of a society at any given time as having a communication ecology, in which the various systems of communication compete for attention, influence, money, and thus power. Each system could be thought of as an organism occupying a niche within the communication environment. Like any set of organisms within a given environment, competition between them will generate friction, particularly at the borders between one ecological niche and another. This competition will precipitate a crisis within an organism, or between organisms, and force them, if they can, to adjust the ways in which they do things, or even the ecological niche which they occupy. This is a dynamic process in which one adaptation or adjustment of a given organism forces contiguous organisms into further change. Some modes of communication will, in consequence, increase in significance or effect, while others will dwindle. For example, technologies such as handwritten documents and faxes, or genre such as epic poetry, or disappear altogether. For example, technologies such as clay tablets, papyrus rolls, and the telegraph, or genres such as chapbooks and broadside ballads. As with the evolution in the natural world, the communication ecology will also be subject to chance and various forms of accident. As with evolution in the natural world, there will be periods of relative quiescence, during which the niches are occupied by systems that fit them well, and the niches relate to each other in a mostly complementary way. There will then be periods in which the communication environment changes, the niches change, and competition and the need for readaptation dramatically increases. This is evolution, characterized by a punctuated equilibrium. This competition will affect not only what systems of communication thrive, which don't, but the nature and form of the information communicated. Changes in the nature or quantity of information in circulation is likely to be part of the feedback loop, which will further modify the communication ecology. For instance, just think of the ripple of effects a simple change in the nature and content of a syllabus can bring about, or the effect that radio, TV, and the internet have had on printed newspapers, or in a minor note, the shift in the balance between Saturday and Sunday editions of the broadsheet newspapers. How might such a model be tested and modified usefully if it proved not quite to match the data? This question leads me to the third and final part of this paper. The period of the Second World War in the UK provides us with a particularly acute case study of the ecology of communication. Into an existing diversity of communications industries, such as the periodical press, book publishing, film, radio, was injected a new type of DNA in the form of government management of news and information about the war. The government was not, however, monolithic, and different agencies within it, such as various ministries and the armed services, attempted to influence the means and content of the various units that were set up to communicate to both the home audience and to widely different markets throughout the world. The Ministry of Information, the Special Operations Executive, and the Political Warfare Executive, among many others, competed fiercely for various roles and various markets. At one remove, the BBC fought to maintain its independence and yet provide outlets for those conducting several information wars. The more established parts of the communication industry accepted some of these initiatives and resisted others. Physical constraints, such as the supply of paper or the problems of distribution throughout a war-torn world, forced further changes in the communication environment and the niches that it offered. Gradually, as the war progressed, the competitive relationships between the various organisms were reduced, and without ever being friction-free, niches were created and occupied in ways which allowed as much cooperation as competition. Now, this was the argument that formed part of the basis for the proposal of publishing and communication history of the Ministry of Information, 1939-1946, that we submitted to the AHRC in 2013 from this very building, Senate House, which the MOI had occupied for the duration. One of the MOI's main jobs was to support and monitor national morale. This was realised through its three distinct but interrelated functions. It was responsible for the production and distribution of informational and propagandist materials within Britain. It undertook the dissemination of information and propaganda to Allied and neutral territories overseas, and it was required to conduct the censorship of news. To add to the complexity, the MOI was an institution that mixed civil servants with a remarkable collection of far from civil characters. Imagine trying to run an organisation that included, among many others, Cecil Beaton, Nicholas Bentley, Brendan Bracken, Kenneth Clark, Duff Cooper, Nancy Cunard, Elizabeth David, Arthur Koestler, Cecil Day-Lewis, Paul Nash, Laurence Olivier, Mervyn Peake, Nicholas Pevsner, Lord Reith, Neville Shute, Ben Travers, Ted Willis, and John Betjeman, and Dylan Thomas. The project is now 18 months old, with another 2.5 years to run. Our current postdoctoral fellow, Henry Irving, who is now moving on to higher things, alas, has done sterling work in sorting out the political and planning processes that set up the MOI, and the various and many changes it underwent in structure and personnel in its first 3 years of existence. The battles it had to establish itself and the adjustments it had to make to various parts of government and other competing sources of information, such as Fleet Street, commercial publishers and BBC, certainly point to a complex ecology of communication within which this large and vigorous new organism had to adapt and adjust. To conclude, let me briefly illustrate a few of the MOI's activities, which together explored most of the communication niches available at the time. The MOI's publishing activities in the UK were substantial. Its output of titles in the official War Books series, which includes Battle of Britain and the spectacularly designed Bomber Command, alone had, by March 1944, sold over 23 million copies and was making a profit of about £30,000 a year. However, this was dwarfed by the production for overseas markets. Virtually every country and inhabited area of the globe, excluding enemy territories, was a potential market for the MOI. For example, from 1941, the MOI was printing at least 2 monthly magazines for international consumption. War in Pictures, with a print run of between 450,000 and 500,000 copies a month, and Neptune, a magazine focusing on the activities of the British Armed Services and their allies, and which was commonly printed in runs of 700 to 800,000 copies a month, with the encouragement to read it and then pass it on as a way of maximising the circulation. But it was not just the monthly print runs that were impressive. It was also the distribution pattern. Quite commonly, both magazines would be distributed to over 80 countries, areas or markets each month, an extraordinary logistical achievement in the midst of a world war. This particular issue of Neptune, for instance, was sent to, among other places, Canada, Australia, Southern Rhodesia, Barbados, Ceylon, Panama, Mexico, Congo, and printed in English, French, and Spanish editions. In all, this issue was distributed to 83 countries and areas, 9,000 to India, for instance, 25,000 to the USA, 400 to Afghanistan in French, and 80 copies to St. Helena. As with many of the products of the UK market, these journals used strikingly modern graphic design to maximise impact. These were not printed products as designed by staid senior civil servants who had been educated in late Victorian or Edwardian times. In these popular publications, images were as important as text, and photographs and graphic art were used extensively, often spread over more than one page and frequently bled over the margins to the edge. Flag magazine. The comics of the interwar period had a readily identifiable impact on other products of the MOI, such as the magazine Flag, which was published in a number of languages. And here, to emphasize the point, is an inner spread. Vivid diagrammatic images, such as cutaway drawings, were also extensively used to explain the technology of current weaponry. Anyone who remembers the striking images presented in British comics in the 1950s and 60s, particularly the Eagle and Girl, will recognize at least one of their origins in these products of the MOI. This was a war fought on almost every front, in which print, paper, card, metal badges, posters, broadcasts, films, and travelling exhibitions could be used as a weapon or as a rallying point. Here, very briefly, are a few hints of this epic range of means of communication. There were stencils that were used in exporting goods from Britain to Russia. There were transfers and stickers. There were pin badges, flags of the Allies. And there were lapel badges, featuring Churchill here. 30,000 of those went to Guatemala, and 40,000 to Persia. Films. There were over 2,000 films and shorts made partly under the auspices of the MOI. This is Anthony Asquith directing Peggy Ashcroft in a film called Channel Incident, which is about Dunkirk. This was being filmed in September 1940, only a few months after Dunkirk. That's Captain Roy Boulting and Colonel Frank Capra editing Tunisian Victory in 1944. And there's a film show taking place in a London transport refectory in 1944. There were posters. We don't know precisely which British city this was, but you can see an astonishing array of posters, one most famous being Dig for Victory, second from the left. You get a sense, don't you, of where the imagery from 1984 comes. That predominance of messaging, where you cannot escape, and indeed the emphasis on victory. But there were also exhibitions and posters. There were about 1,000 copies of this particular poster printed that were distributed to a variety of shops throughout the UK, simply giving information about Allied bombing raids on Germany as a sort of attempt to show we could hit back even during the Blitz. And you can see that's simply a poster put up in the middle of a shop window surrounded by other advertising. But there were many more sophisticated exhibitions than that. This is a travelling exhibition just leaving Senate House, and this one promotes the importance of salvage and the need to recycle materials. Private Scraps is in town. Charing Cross Tube Station had a whole section set aside for major Ministry of Information exhibitions throughout the war, and this one is on the war in the South Pacific. The largest of all exhibitions was mounted in the bombed-out basement of John Lewis in Oxford Street, where in 1943 was an astonishingly extensive exhibition on the British Army. This then travelled to Birmingham and finally to Cardiff. Here's a poster advertising a particularly popular exhibition. It's how to grow food off the ration, particularly how to cultivate rabbits and pigs and hens. And here is an example of that very exhibition, again back in Charing Cross Underground Station, where the land girls are providing you with examples of the kind of hen you should keep and the kind you should weed out. There's no sentimentality there. We are not yet halfway through the project, but it is already clear that we are observing the creation and operation of a globally important information organization using a variety of types of communication in a range of languages and employing most of the then available forms of physical transport and non-physical transmission systems. They even had little flyers that were to be dropped from bombers, simply containing the oath of Hippocrates and implying that that oath could only be carried out in free countries. Another little flyer that would tumble from an aircraft would tell you how to tune in to the BBC. It may have been very new and very short-lived in comparison with communication systems over the last 5,000 years, but if we can construct a model of the ecology of communication based upon the MOI, then we will have a hypothesis that will be well worth testing on earlier periods of communication history, such as on the impact of alphabetic systems on writing in the first millennium BC, or the emergence of codex between the 1st and 5th century AD, or the arrival of paper in Europe in the 12th century, on the economic shock to the system represented by the Gutenberg Revolution, on the innovations of stereotyping and electrotyping, or on the arrival of standardized time in the 1840s. However, even the broadest historical process of communication must finally, if it is to serve any useful purpose, have an impact on the individual reader or observer, both on contemporaries and on us. I shall leave you with a literary image and a photographic image, both of which return us to the building in which the Ministry of Information operated and which we currently occupy. The literary image is from George Orwell's 1984. In the novel, the Ministry of Information has been transformed into the Ministry of Truth, or Mini-True. I quote, "The Ministry of Truth was startlingly different from any other object in sight. It was an enormous pyramidal structure of glitteringly white concrete, soaring up, terrace upon terrace, 300 meters into the air." I should perhaps remind you that when this was written, Senate House was the second tallest building in London, so it would have dominated the skyline in a way it does not do so today. The photographic image is from a 1943 campaign to encourage women to find utility clothing attractive. Models were photographed on the leads of a building in Bloomsbury with the enormous pyramidal structure of Senate House looming in the background. Of course, in any act of communication, there may well be a gap between what was intended and what was received, and the time at which it was received, as this image might suggest. Post-Orwell, can we look at this photograph as those it was intended for looked at it in 1943? In any study of communication, it is the far from passive receiver who is most difficult to get at and to reconstruct historically. Now, it is at this point that the MOI project may prove additionally promising. Throughout most of the war, the Ministry's Home Intelligence Unit compiled weekly reports assessing such concerns as civilian morale, current rumours, and also reaction to various MOI campaigns. Add this to the various public opinion surveys compiled by the Wartime Social Survey Unit, and we have a well-documented amount of feedback from those whom the Ministry was specifically addressing, and with whose views and whose morale it was particularly concerned. The MOI, situated as it was in a period which intensely exemplified, in Burton's phrase, the gallantry and misery of the world, will provide us with a vivid and extensive account of an ecology of communication, while those it addressed and those who responded to it will allow us to complete the circuit of communication by a study of its feedback. Of course, feedback in this case is not the most usual form of feedback in a circuit, which is frequently designed to regulate a system, keeping it on an even keel. In communication history, Feedback at some stage alters the initial conditions. So when you complete the loop, you do not return to the place from which you started. It is not, therefore, strictly speaking, a circuit, but a spiral, a helix, which is twisting up or twisting down through time, and whose diameter is dependent on the quantity of information involved. But that is definitely another matter.